Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video with Mr. Terry as I continue my quest for historical knowledge here on the internet. Alright, what we're doing is watching part 2 of the British Empire, little two-part series by History Matters. And so the first one was, they titled the Early British Empire, and this one is the Late British Empire. And it looks like right here what they're doing is picking up in 1783, so you got Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolution, and American independence is now in effect, but the British Empire sort of lives on. So we'll go ahead and pick up here. Link to the original video will be down below if you want to go over and support them. Give them a like and subscribe. That would be great. And if you like what we're doing here, love to have you as a subscriber right here. Okay, let's go ahead and jump on in. 1783.
1783, and the Americans have left. The empire, led by King George III, famous for being crazy, now had to find a new place for a penal colony, and it found one in Australia. So both Australia and New Zealand have been known to Europeans for centuries because of past Dutch explorers.
So I was saying here that there definitely is a direct link that when the British sort of lose what eventually be the United States, that definitely had a direct relationship to them pursuing Australia more. And specifically, I guess, with the whole penal colony thing that you know Australia is has become famous for, right? As your country was just founded as a penal colony. That's kind of something people always bring up. But yeah, I never really had tied together how direct maybe those might be. Fall of America to sort of the push into Australia by the British. Interesting.
It was Captain James Cook who sailed to both and claimed them for Britain. New South Wales was chosen as Britain's penal colony, and the first convicts arrived in...
Claimed, right? People are already there. It's been claimed, right? But I always found that term claiming interesting. Like, what does that even mean? There's people there, right? There's already natives. There's other people, claim it. Because by that definition, you can claim anything.
1788. So in the next year, the French Revolution happened, paving the way for the Napoleonic Wars, which were a British victory. Victory here gave Britain a few new colonies, such as Malta and South Africa. Importantly, it also weakened Britain's great imperial rival, meaning it could increase the size of its empire without much resistance, which it did. The century following the Napoleonic Wars is known as the Pax Britannica, the British peace, in which...
They use this term so much, because you got the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now it's supposed to be the great... period of the Roman Empire, from the creation of the empire to the for the least the next couple centuries, right? And then you get like the Pax Mongolica, and then I don't know if people just name this themselves. You got the Pax Britannica. I haven't necessarily heard that label being really put for a British time period, but I don't know if it cheapens the term or something like that, because when you do this, you're immediately going to think of like the Roman Republic or Mongol Empire.
Britain was the world's sole superpower. Over the next few decades, Britain, which Ireland had formerly been incorporated into, seized Guyana, Singapore, Assam, and this territory in India. Britain was helped in these ventures by the East India Company, who oversaw Britain's trade with China, mostly in opium. China had previously banned opium, but Britain refused to listen and kept importing it anyway because money. In 1830...
Yeah, talked about this last time if you saw the previous video. The British wanted to trade everywhere, right? And... China, of course, has the best natural resources of kind of this of the world, but didn't want any British goods. I mean, the Chinese economy and their own manufacturing far surpassed anything else going on in the world, and didn't want anything from Europe. I mean, anything the Europeans make or the British make, specifically, the Chinese probably make it better. So they don't want imported goods, right? And actually, for a long time, going back centuries before this, when Europeans first started showing up, the Chinese have always been picky about what would be traded. They didn't need goods. What they would take was money, though. They would sell their stuff, to Europeans. But they basically just wanted like gold and silver. You know what I mean? So basically, just currency, not really goods. So they limited that, and were very limited in their trade, anyways. They would, if like coming into, especially in the earlier years, though, but. If Europeans came into China, there were only a handful of port cities that would be allowed for them to go into. No one was allowed to stay permanently, and they basically had government minders with you, watching you all the time, and it was very, very restrictive, right? with this. But of course, what happened slowly over time is Europeans became more and more entrenched and a little bit more forceful, and you're definitely going to see that peak with things. Kind of these more anti-Western kind of movements that happen out of China, something like like the Boxer Rebellion, which had that, and then the results of these usually led to more and more influence into China, and that was slowly happening over time. And you see like the British were trying to keep trying to find ways to get in, and the one thing they found out is if the general trading relationship wasn't going to allow like goods, well, find something they can't refuse, like get him addicted to opium, get him addicted to drugs, which they were getting out of their other imperial colonies in Asia. The British were, and got a lot of people hooked, going right up to the top highest classes of society came on this. And you see when eventually the Chinese government and was trying to end this and wanted to kind of just stop this, and the British said no, we're not leaving. And of course you get the Opium War, so just based essentially a giant drug war to try to protect the British, or the British to protect their ability to be able to sell opium, which, like I said, is incredibly profitable. And that's just going to lead to more havoc and less autonomy for the Chinese. Is now they're going to be fighting against some of these modern military powers that have really come a long way.
In 1959, the Imperial Chinese government seized opium from British ships and destroyed it, which led to armed conflict, which Britain won, gaining lots of money, a continuation of opium selling in Hong Kong.
Yep.
Britain's victory
basically took Hong Kong
gave a huge influence over China's
away.
economy, bringing it into what is known as the
Get their own trade
Empire.
port.
The Informal Empire consisted of places which weren't directly under British control, but due to military and diplomatic pressure were often coerced into acting in Britain's interest.
There are more European powers, or Western powers in general. They're going to have what they call them spheres of influence. They say indirect control. Another term that we're using here is spheres of influence, like parts of China that were exclusively dominated economically by Westerners, right? And a bunch of European nations had that, a good half dozen or so probably. So the British are one of them, but you can see that happening here. By the way, they're getting a lot of their opium over here in South Asia, what would today be like Afghanistan, Pakistan, that kind of region. That's where the British are getting a lot of this. And is still a producer of this today.
To the northwest of India, Britain turned its eyes to Afghanistan. On the surface, this was for trade, but the major reason was Russia. Britain was afraid that Russia would seize either Afghanistan or Persia, from which it could then invade India. Britain was also worried that Afghanistan would make an alliance with Russia and so invaded. This was a complete disaster and amounted to nothing more than a slaughter of British and Indian troops by the Afghan militias.
Nasty stuff. Great game, yeah.
Between Britain and Russia is known as the Great Game and spread beyond Asia and into Europe. The Russians were increasing their influence in the Balkans, and Britain was worried about Russian dominance there as well. In order to curb Russia, Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire began the Crimean War, which was a victory for the Allies and slowed the growing Russian power.
Also, the Crimean War, probably one of the more important wars you may have never heard of as well. It was a total war with, at least what they say is kind of balance of power, and it also is interesting because some of these alliances, like the one with the Ottoman Empire, the British and French had, they go with the Ottoman Empire, but then later, they're going to fight each other in World War I, which is going to be less than 100 years later here. But you kind of see interestingly how alliances change a lot, especially in this modern era, this imperial one. You get a lot more of like, hey, I'm going to ally with you because you're an enemy of an enemy kind of thing. Not because we actually have like a nice, tight, friendly relationship, but enemy of my enemy. In this one, it's Russia. But then later you see, of course, the Russians are going to ally with these other Western nations like France. So it's amazing how quickly things can change when it comes to alliances and politics. But this is going to be a major blow, by the way, to Russia here with the results of the Crimean War.
Power. In North America, Canada was established as a province, and the borders between itself and the US were finalized. Canada later gained autonomy by becoming a dominion, which meant that the colony was self-governing, but foreign policy was left to Britain. Also about...
a lot of kids have asked me, what if America never fought in the American Revolution? What if they just kind of continued with kind of being a British colony? What would have happened? You know what I mean? And the thing to do with precedent is you could set as a precedent is basically what happened to Canada. So what would have happened? I mean, America probably would have turned into basically what Canada is, right? where you slowly get this autonomy, but you have this kind of official yet unofficial direct leadership or direct relationship, I should say, with the British. So yeah, people say, like, what would America be like if they had never fought the revolution? And maybe it's not a great way to say it. I'd say we'd basically be Canada. Be like Canada. And then they go, oh, all right, okay. So then you can make your opinion from there of what that would be like.
About this time, the British began to settle New Zealand. At first, the Maori, the natives of New Zealand, were fine with the Europeans as they brought trade to them, but eventually it dawned on them that the Europeans weren't going to stop coming.
This is a common thing that has happened in a bunch of the early relationships that Europeans had with locals, because every once in a while in these places, especially in Asia, they'd be kind of welcoming at first and they'd be like, all right, we'll establish this relationship. I see how it could be mutually beneficial. And then it just becomes more and more forceful until they often they lose their nation. And some countries, saw that as an example of what was going on in other nations. In a way, one of the first examples you saw this that really was an example for other nations was what happened with the Philippines. I mean, right away with Ferdinand Magellan and the Spanish start getting there and they develop this relationship with them and all that. And then it becomes very abusive eventually, and they see what happens. One of the countries that saw that and really changed their foreign policy was Japan, actually. So because at first, like, Japan was welcoming some of these early traders from like Portugal or other Western nations, and then they saw, like, some of the atrocities and some of the awful things that were happening with like Spanish-held Philippines, and then changed their tune completely and said, no, we're done. That was with like the Tokugawa, who are going to close their borders off to Westerners. But yeah, they use that. And again, it's just that idea that it's like sometimes it starts off pretty beneficial, and then just as it becomes profitable, these Western nations become more and more forceful until you've basically been colonized completely and taken over, like it's happening here. And sometimes it's too late. Like the Maori put up an incredible fight here, and a lot of these groups did, but it's just they're in a lot of ways get kind of outmatched.
This led to war, which the British won, leading to more European settlement. In contrast to populating New Zealand, Ireland faced one of the greatest depopulations in human history thanks to the potato famine, which decimated potato harvests. The British forced the Irish to grow cash crops, which meant that there was less space to grow food there. The Irish grew potatoes since they had such a high caloric yield for the space they took up. When the famine struck, it was made...
Always interesting when you look at the potato famine, just the value of potatoes that happened in Europe. And you remember that potatoes are not native to Europe. They came from South America and what was the Inca Empire, and was brought over to Europe and becomes a major staple food product pretty quickly all over Europe, right? In Russia, and then of course in like the UK and in mainland Europe and places like Germany. And interesting how it almost seems like how quickly they became almost reliant on the food. Like the Irish became so reliant that when the whatever that kind of like crop disease or whatever that like was killing off the potatoes or whatever, when that happened, it led to direct starvations and people dying in huge numbers. And of course that decimated the population either from death or from exodus out of Ireland. And as you saw there, big chunk of people of course went to the United States, and you saw a huge Irish immigration movement here in the later 1800s.
Worse by the British government, who ordered that food would still be exported from Ireland to Britain and that aid would be limited. Ireland's population dropped by half and still has yet to recover to
I didn't know it was that much.
Levels.
Half?
All the way back in India, Britain, specifically the independent East India Company, was having some trouble. So background. The East India Company's military was mostly staffed by Sepoys, who were Indian troops who served under British officers. These Sepoys became increasingly unhappy as their treatment worsened. Their pay stagnated, and they were also forced to fight abroad despite British promises that they wouldn't have to. British policy in India had also led to massive changes in its society as well, which upset many of those living there. For example, the British levied heavy taxes and did nothing to protect the Indian textile industry.
Taxation without representation.
For example, the British
We've heard of that.
Taxes.
America. I don't know if they're going to come back to it, but looking at some of these changes, going back, I don't think they're going to talk about it. I'm going to let the video see if they catch this, and then if they do, I don't want to be redundant. There's something I want to say about one of the things that upset the Sepoys, which again were Indians that served in basically the British military. That way, the British love to use that kind of indirect recruitment for their armies and stuff like that. It was more efficient, more cost effective. But going back to some of the changes, practice of sati. Sati was a centuries old practice of definitely a show of social patriarchy, where like they say here, if you haven't heard of this, where if a husband died, they would burn the body or whatever, but it was kind of expected that the wife would follow suit and basically join their husband in death in the literal funeral pyre, right? So and when he dies, like, you go basically with him. And the British thought that was barbaric, and wanted to end that, because again, there's this old cultural practice. If you go back to some of some of the older texts that talk about this, and this is it was one of the I remember it was one of the documents in one of the AP exams that I had given out, which was basically like a justification of that. It was basically saying that a woman basically no longer serves a purpose once the husband is gone. You know what I mean? So adding that. And I would, maybe by this time too, it had become less popular as time went on there. But yeah, banning polygamy, child marriage, which definitely happened with the amount of arranged marriages between families in Indian culture, and then outlaw slavery. Okay, so yeah.
In its society as well, which upset many of those living there. For example, the British levied heavy taxes and did nothing to protect the Indian textile industry. The British were also arbitrarily grabbing more and more territory, which understandably made some Indian rulers nervous. Furthermore, the British were also keen proselytizers, and many Hindus and Muslims felt that the British wanted to convert all of India to Christianity. None of this endeared the British to the Indians, and in 1857,
maybe not wrong there though,
against the East India Company. One Sepoy, called Mangal Pandey, mutinied against the British by assaulting some officers, and his execution made him a martyr. The earlier British defeat in Afghanistan also gave confidence to the Indians, since it meant that the British could be defeated. The actual rebellion began when Indians were issued with ammunition coated in either pig or beef fat, which offended both the Muslim and Hindu Sepoys. When they refused to use the ammunition, the British arrested them, and they, alongside others, mutinied.
Okay, so just to review it, an interesting thing that starts a massive rebellion against the British originated from there's a lot of instances, but largely it came from this instance. So you got sepoys, right? So they're hired Indians that work for the British in the British military. And there was these new rifles, the Enfield rifle that had come out. And the cartridges for this basically required you bite the cartridge, and then you can be able to load it. Now these were greased, right? These were greased so it could use more properly with the weapon, and it was greased in an animal fat. Okay, and the problem with this is that it was talked about. I don't know if it was rumored or was official. That it was basically greased in an animal fat, either cow or pig, so like beef, pork, whatever. And the issue with that is the religious beliefs. So for these Indian sepoys, most of them are either Hindu or Muslim. And the problem with both of those animals for Hindus, beef and consumption of beef is against their religion. And then for Muslims, pig is. So this was incompatible with their religious beliefs to be able to do this. And they were refusing to use this rifle. And then it kind of rolled from there into being just more of not just a protest for using this rifle, but ends up being basically just an anti-British imperialist revolt that ends up, of course, being massive. And a lot of people kind of consider this almost like, although there has been other sort of revolutions and revolts in a way by the Indian people, this is the kind of the big one that gets a lot of notoriety. And what some people say, this is like the closest that India gets to what would have been like the American Revolution. This is the difference. So why don't you call it like the Sepoy Revolution or something like that? Well, I've heard a historical claim about that, and they basically said, well, it's because the Indians lost. If America had lost the American Revolution, right, or fight for independence, whatever you want to call it, it probably would have just been called the American Revolt, in history. And so I always thought that was kind of interesting when I had heard that. Anyway, let's continue on with the whole Sepoy Rebellion here.
When they refused to use the ammunition, the British arrested them, and they, alongside others, mutinied. The rebelling Sepoys seized some cities, including Delhi, but eventually the British were able to defeat them. The reasons for this were that only a few Indian states actually joined the rebellion. Many were neutral, and support for the British remained strong.
Yeah.
One reason
they talked about that before in the other episode, which was there were so many of these princes in these kingdoms out here that were very much in the pocket of the British. They had received And the British were pretty smart about this. They would find these leaders and help them get into power and establish a good relationship with them. And then these princes or whatever would basically almost serve like puppets of the British. And because they worked hand in hand, they benefited a lot from the British experience. So yeah, it was hard to get everybody to be unified because so many powerful people, Indians, were absolutely working with the British and were loyal to them because they've been given so much, so many benefits. You know what I mean? They could get, their kids would get Western educations. That would happen, and a lot of them, went on to go back to England, go to London, go to like a law school. Someone like Gandhi, for example, who was able to benefit from these kind of relationships from his family because he was able to go to London, go to law school. And of course, the irony in that though is he basically uses that education to go back to India and pursue independence, right? And that doesn't happen. And just so you know, that's how long it's going to take until they get their independence, is all the way till the 1940s, and we're talking still here almost 100 years before that.
The reason for this was that the concept of being Indian didn't really exist. India is an exceptionally diverse place, and a Muslim from Bengal or a Sikh from
hard to
Punjab
unify
have little in common with a Hindu from Delhi. Another reason for the rebellion's failure was that it was not a pre-planned, politically backed uprising, and the British had much better organisation. The cost incurred in money, prestige and lives led the British Crown to take control of the running of India, and the East India Company was dissolved in 1858, and Queen Victoria was proclaimed the Empress of India.
Yeah.
The British...
So basically what they do, so remember, India has been indirectly basically ruled by a company, right? East India Company, where I told you Walmart with an army kind of thing. But of course, they operate with the permission of the Queen. So they used indirect rule for many decades. And then once it was over, right, and the sort of East India Company wins and Britain wins, the Queen says, you know what, India now under direct control by the Crown. Direct control, not doing the indirect thing. We're in control. So they lose, India loses, and that gets ruled even harder.
Which also gained more land from the Indians, removing disloyal chiefs called Nawabs from power. Britain's dominance over its colonies was secured by increasing technological advancements brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Some of the
that just fueled it.
Of these advancements were the steam-powered ship, trains, the telegram, and more advanced firearms. This dominance wouldn't last forever, and towards the end of the century, Britain found itself with new rivals. These were the United States, which was recovering from its civil war, the newly unified German Empire, and a rising Japan, which was looking to carve up Asia.
These are the new world players. Look at these four right here. These are the new world players. These are among the first nations to industrialize, right? Britain was the first. Interesting, Belgium was second, but of course Belgium, being a smaller nation, didn't have quite the resources to keep up. But Germany, America begins rapid industrialization after the Civil War. I mean, it started before that, but afterwards it really just exploded. And then Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, when they restore the emperor back to power, they start, I think, in a way, kind of seeing what's going on in the world, and they're like, we need to advance technologically, maybe even adopt a lot of this westernization, because it's almost like, I think the Japanese almost felt like we need to use westernization in the process of that to defeat Westerners. So they do that. And the fact of all the nations involved, Japan industrialized the fastest. I mean, I've heard them say Japan industrialized in like 10 years, where like somewhere like Britain, it took 100 years. They were able to use all these different examples. They have a homogenous society. They've got the resources. And that also begins their imperial ambition. So what you're looking at with these four is the birth of really, well, Britain's already been doing it, but attempted industrialization. I like to use this kind of train of thought where it's like industrialization led to imperialism, right? Those that industrialize tend to imperialize, because industrialization is an exponential process where the more you industrialize, the more you need to industrialize. You need more resources, you need more trade markets, you need more literal land, your population is growing, you have to basically spread, otherwise you top out. And that, of course, so you get this industrialization leads to imperialism, and of course imperialism is one of the big factors that's going to lead to the world war. So you're seeing a domino effect here, because other things imperialism leads to is other isms. For example, nationalism. The more successful your country is with industrialization and imperialism, the stronger the feeling of pride and almost cockiness in a way of a nation is inevitably tied to that. And then also militarism, which is definitely an effect of imperialism, because the bigger your empire is, the more you need to protect it. So the more you grow your military, the more your military, or the more you need it to grow, the more military you need. The more military you need, the more suspicious people become, and potentially the more likelihood of war. So you can see these dominoes going through, and really get, of course, topped over inevitably with the world wars. So that's just a bigger framing that you can kind of think here. A context going on.
The new German Empire wanted colonies of its own and so turned to Africa. This worried the British, and in order to soothe tensions, the Berlin Conference was called to divide up Africa in a way that avoided war. So Africa went from looking like this to this, with
Unbelievable, right? Berlin Conference. Basically a table, of some Europeans are going to settle the entire fate of Africa here, right? So you have these Asian conquests coming a little bit slower, and Africa was what they thought was totally kind of up for grabs, and scramble for Africa. It's like a big piece of pizza. 7 or so different European nations or Western nations come in and take basically all of it. There's only 2 exceptions. Ethiopia, which militarily was the only nation to defend itself, and that was against the Italians. You do have Liberia, which eventually becomes kind of a protector to the United States, but every other piece was basically taken over with basically little to no influence or even listening to African leaders. I mean, this Berlin Conference, you can't imagine there was a bunch of African leaders there actually giving their opinion, and there wasn't. So their fate was totally taken out of their hands and then put into the hands here. So this imperialism tied to industrialization is just exploding, and it's leading to this Western kind of dominating world here in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
with Britain and France getting the lion's share. So the British public's response to imperialism was mixed. Outright opposition to colonialism was very rare. Most people's attitude sat between apathy
Nationalism,
and deep pride in
right?
Britain's role as a colonial power. This was primarily due to the belief that Britain was a civilizing force.
Sure.
So
It's like the more they kind of believe that, like, our civilization's great, and the more of us in the world, more of our civilization in the world, the better the world's going to be, right? Look at some of the famous literature that came out of there, right? Something like White Man's Burden, Rudyard Kipling. Or anything coming out of Cecil Rhodes, right? Some of the famous pieces that come out of that definitely explain that, and were kind of become staples of this.
Britain's conquest of Africa was not a simple and straightforward affair.
No, it was difficult.
Britain had substantial military advantages over the Africans it was conquering, such as rifles, machine guns, and gunboats.
That Maxim machine gun was maybe the biggest one.
Substantial military
Because-
advantages over the Africans it was conquering, such as rifles, machine guns, and gunboats.
Because muskets had now been common in a lot of places in Africa. They use them in New Zealand too, by the way. One of the people, but so they had muskets. But the problem is like with these older rifles, like the British, for example, had progressed past that with early machine guns, the Maxim machine gun here. So you started to see that, and that it was unbelievable how effective like these machine guns weapons were, and these machine gun sort of what do you call them, nests or whatever, in these battles, because if you look at the fatality counts in some of these battles, they're just incredibly high up, with local African armies with European armies. Okay, and they couldn't keep up with it, but yeah, they're progressing. It's like the Europeans are always technologically a step ahead.
Boats. Yet many Africans were able to win victories against the British, such as the Zulus, who slaughtered the British at the Battle of Isandlwana.
But not substantially.
On the same day, the British won one of its best-known battles, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Another group of Africans, the Boers, who were originally Dutch settlers, also resisted British expansion in South Africa. In order to defeat Boer guerrilla warfare by denying them shelter, the British placed many women and children into concentration camps where they faced horrible conditions. The conquest of Africa was short and was pretty much complete after 30 years, with only Ethiopia and Liberia remaining independent. The southern colonies in Africa were unified into South Africa, which alongside Australia and New Zealand became a dominion, just like Canada. The empire grew to its territorial height after the First World War, where Britain gained sizable Ottoman and German territory.
Heard that term, the sun never sets on the British Empire? That's what that literally meant, is they're in like every time zone possible. right? It's daytime. The sun is shining somewhere in what was considered the British Empire. That's where that term comes from. And now you can see a little bit more of what they're talking about. I remember seeing once, I'm sure you'll be able to comment on it pretty quick. I remember seeing some videos and seeing some numbers about like what percentage of Earth, of the planet or whatever, the world's nations have fought the British before. And I remember it was absurd. Maybe someone can find that number and let people know in the comments or something. I remember seeing that and it was like, are you kidding me? It was like it seemed like everybody has had some kind of run-in with the British before. Amazing.
It wasn't all gains for Britain, though, as throughout the war, Britain's hold on Ireland became untenable, and Ireland became an independent republic in 1922.
Bye, Ireland.
From the crumbling Ottoman Empire, the British gained Palestine, which it was decided would become a home for the world's Jewish people. Hundreds of thousands of Jews arrived in Palestine over the next couple of decades, and their increasing numbers and political powers there caused several revolts against the British, all of which were suppressed. After the Second World War, many more arrived.
Balfour Declaration, I did some extensive research on this in college, is one of the most important little pieces of documents in history, in modern history at least, because it basically paves the way for this home for the Jews in the Middle East here after World War One. And you've seen what the creation of the Jewish state has done for the political climate of the Middle East. It's been nothing but tumultuous for now the over 100 years there, because it angered so many people locally as with Palestine here, and then it basically being kind of established, or not necessarily established for, but definitely kind of enabled the movement of Jews to go back to their historic homeland, which had been kicked out of had left for a long time, for many centuries, and in some cases millennia, going back to, like, for example, the Romans and the destruction of Jerusalem there, and then being driven out, and then after the Islamic kingdoms came over and took over as well. So and especially with a lot of this being established without a lot of the Arab input, and their response ends up kind of failing to it, and also has resulted in numerous wars, in the last century. Between the Jewish state and basically the entire Arab world. So you can see how important this was. But definitely look in, if you don't know much about the Balfour Declaration, not just to spend more time on this here right now, definitely look into it, and you'll be able to see a lot more connections about why there are so many issues in the Middle East. And a lot of it centers around and kind of starts with that domino that was started by the Balfour Declaration. So definitely look into that if you don't know much about it.
It caused several revolts against the British, all of which were suppressed. After the Second World War, many more arrived, and the tensions rose again, culminating in a civil war and the creation of Israel.
Yeah, the Holocaust really, in a way, did wonders for the global community to sort of respect the idea of Palestine as a home for Jews because of the Holocaust and the brutality of it, and a sympathy that was created for the Jewish community as they were leaving Europe and trying to leave this persecution, and then flooding into Palestine again, all while the local community was very kind of upset about this was continuing to happen. And you saw there were protests and try to stop it, but ended up in failures.
So the Second World War was a British victory, but had brought Britain to the brink of economic ruin. Indians had been seeking independence from Britain since about 5 minutes after it turned up. Many Indians felt that their contribution to both world wars meant that they were owed independence. Yeah. In 1937, India held elections in which the Indian National Congress, an advocate for independence, won the largest share of the seats.
The decolonization process, right, started happening, of course, with the end of World War I. Now, where this is only really happens, though, is people that lose the wars. Right? In World War I, you had this decolonization process that began, self-determination, right? Basically the ability for a nation to determine if it wants its own independence or not. And of course that took place. That was one of the big things that was being proposed by like President Wilson. A lot of people were trying to make sure it was part of the Treaty of Versailles and all this. And it happened, but only in colonies of the places that lost. The Allies were in no way interested in losing their colonies, like the British or the French or something like that. So you started to see decolonization happen from German colonies, from British colonies, German colonies in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so kind of their colonies. And then the Ottoman Empire. That's why you see after World War I, those nations get broken up into a bunch of different independent groups. But you didn't see that process happen among the Allied nations. And those Allied nations, those colonies, like India, for example, were upset, saying, hey, it's like you're fighting for these or allowing these freedoms of these people, but not us, people that helped you win the war. Because like they were saying, all these nations recruited incredibly high numbers of people from their colonies, right? Africans and people from Asia, and these high numbers. And it's like we fought, we died, and then got nothing out of the war. And we're hoping, this would kind of be leverage. And that didn't happen after World War I. And now it's happening again after World War II, where they're like, hey, we fought again, even higher numbers, and we're still not getting more rights, right? And that's when, of course, the decolonization movement really picks up, is after World War II. When also because of the economic and political turmoil that the world wars caused, places like Britain are no longer able to keep their colonies like they were before. They don't have the resources to do that. So the independence movements that are going to come here are going to be far more successful because of that timing. And that's what you're going to start to see with India, especially here after the war. It really pick up. We got Jawaharlal Nehru, and then Mohandas Gandhi, which are going to come in here, and you're going to start to see this. And you start seeing in India, you're going to see it in Southeast Asia, and then in Africa. And of course, it took decades, depending on where you were. Some of these places took many, many decades to actually get their independence.
Furthermore, the famine of 1943, which was caused mostly by Britain diverting food away from India, had cost the lives of many millions, increasing demands for the end of British rule. The most famous opponents to the British were Mohandas Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
The whole Bengal famine is something that people really criticize that Western culture is overlooking, is this. And since it's from a successful Western nation, that has allowed it to be dragged under the rug, almost as a genocide in a way. Because people talk about the deaths, like the Holocaust or the brutality of the Japanese in World War II, and then that lets these things kind of get swept under the rug. And you may not be able to equate a lot of these exactly, but nevertheless, you have that question being asked: as why are some of these things being ignored? And like you saw, there was basically an almost a very directly affected by the British. Massive famine of death of millions that ends up happening because of mismanagement and actual decisions being made by the British here. So, not something that should be, glossed over, which definitely has been.
The end of British rule. The most famous opponents to the British were Mohandas Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Gandhi was not a politician, but was very important since he practiced a non-violent approach. Jinnah is famous for advocating that India be divided so that Muslims could have their own state as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I'm stopping. I'm sorry if that's annoying to you that I'm stopping. There's so many things I want to talk about, and this is definitely an area that I take a lot of pride in trying to learn about and trying to make sure it's expressed. Is what you started to see here is now more movements in India to actually unify the people. Remember they talked about during all this British occupation, people didn't identify as just Indian. It's such a diverse country, and a lot of it has to do with the religious diversity, with Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus unable to unify and get past their differences. And that's what you started to see with Jinnah, who's kind of leading kind of the Muslim coalition here, and then Gandhi kind of leading more of a Hindu side, and trying to bring these together, right? Bring these movements together with a common show of force against the British. And that's what they believed they needed, because all these revolts and stuff they never had that unification. And so, of course, it's power in numbers. But an interesting thing to add here, they just talked about, was with Jinnah and the Muslim side, was them from the get-go, even before independence was happening, trying to establish that there needs to be a Muslim state founded from independent India here. They did not. What they were really afraid of was that once the British leave, because one thing the British did a fairly good job, or I don't know, a fairly good job at did a job at, was keeping the Hindu and Muslim communities from basically annihilating each other, like from fighting each other and that sort of thing, keeping that more settled. And of course, Hindus are the majority in the nation, and they're afraid that once the British leave, that a Hindu majority would basically take over and oppress the Islamic minority. So they want from the get-go that if the British leave and if they get independence, there needs to be a state established specifically for Indian Muslims. And of course, that's going to happen. They'll talk about here. That's what Pakistan ends up being. But interesting thing that happened. And Gandhi was actually against the partition of India. He thought that Hindus and Muslims should be able to unify and be able to work successfully in one state. So he was never actually a fan of the partition. But by the way, the British will be. When they leave, they want to see this happen. They think it'll be a more peaceful situation. And in some ways it was, and in some ways it wasn't. We'll see if they get to that. But then you're getting to more Indian history, and those videos talking about British history, because like one of the logistical nightmare of, okay, you're going to set up 2 states, and they end up doing actually 2 Pakistans, basically one in the west and one in the east, and which was a nightmare to try to organize. Is like, hey, you're part of Pakistan here, but you're also part of Pakistan, and you're under the same governing body, but you're separated by an entire giant subcontinent. That didn't work, and of course, what ends up happening is you had West Pakistan, East Pakistan. East Pakistan ends up becoming Bangladesh, become its own independent nation. But the logistical nightmare of, okay, now we have these different countries, everyone needs to move now. All right, if you are a Hindu living in this eastern part or in this western part, you got to find a way to move your entire life and your whole family and your upbringing and your ancestry into what's supposed to be the Hindu home, and then vice versa, of course, for Muslims. And that is a logistic nightmare to do that, and it actually when this ends up happening, creating the largest migration in history. And because the tensions were also high between these groups, it was extremely violent. What are the numbers on the death of the Great Migration? Like 1 million, I think, maybe. People end up dying in the cross-caravanning, if you want to call it cross-caravanning violence. Because it's not like there was this... It's not like a foreign exchange program where it's like, all right, you're going to find this Hindu family right here, and they live over here in this town, and or a Hindu family lives over here, and they're going to move to this part of India, and then you have a Muslim family that's going to go over here, and we're going to like match up families, and what's going to happen is they're each going to move and take each other's, homes and jobs and stuff like that. No, what it ended up doing is basically making millions of people homeless and making people refugees. And it was just like, all right, you're out, go find a new life somewhere else. And that was very difficult. It was not managed very well at all. But it was the thing that when the British leave, they were kind of supportive of, because they're like, on paper, this sounds like a perfect idea, right? They'll have a home, and then they'll have a home, and then there won't be need for any violence or anything like that. But a logistical nightmare.
In 1947, India gained its independence and was subsequently divided into India and Pakistan. Britain was unable to fight this tide due to its weakness. It simply couldn't afford to force India to stay. Furthermore, Clement Attlee, Britain's post-war Prime Minister, was sympathetic to the Indian cause. The division of India was not so peaceful, though, and it is believed that during the mass migration, ethnic cleansing and fighting that occurred afterwards, as many as 2 million people died.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of World War II, Britain found itself opposed by 2 anti-imperialist superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Slowly but surely, over the course of the 20th century, colonies broke away from British rule, some violently, some peacefully. A notable example of British imperial retreat is Kenya. Kenya had been run similarly to most other colonies, with white settlers owning lots of land, amassing wealth and forcing horrible working conditions on the natives. Many Kenyans, notably Jomo Kenyatta, attempted to get reforms from the British, all of which were refused. Some Kenyans then turned to violence, and what is known as the Mau Mau uprising began. The Mau Mau resorted to guerrilla warfare, but the British were able to suppress the uprising after capturing its leaders. Both sides committed horrendous war crimes, including torture and the murder of women and children. In 1960, Britain announced that it would move towards an independent Kenya, and in 1963, Kenya gained its independence with Kenyatta as its first president. Britain's motives for this were simple: the writing was on the wall and the empire was going to end. Harold Macmillan,
can't keep control of it anymore,
made sure that the handover of power was swift to help promote good relations between Britain and its former colonies. Decolonization would continue for the next several decades until Britain's last major colony, Hong Kong, was handed back to China in 1997, thus marking the end of the empire. So in conclusion, the legacy of the British Empire is undeniable. One only needs to look at a map of countries that drive on the left, play cricket or rugby, or still have the British monarch as their head of state. Opinions on the empire range from it being a civilising force to an oppressive one. What can be said for definite is that without the empire, the world would have looked very different today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
I want to add just one more thing before we leave. And it's the decolonization practice that a lot of these nations had. You know, Britain was more of an indirect colonizing when it comes to rule of places. They thought it more financial and politically efficient to rule indirectly, get leaders, people, locals that are loyal, and rule indirectly. Let them kind of do their thing, but they, of course, answer the British. Whereas a contrast like the French were very much more about direct rule, which is also much more expensive. So the British like to do that and leave. One thing that didn't happen in any of these countries, whether they were British colonies, French colonies, whatever, is a very good transition process to independence. Let's remember that these colonies, especially in like Africa or Asia, the priority of these colonies was to benefit the mother nation back in Europe. Right, you talk about it was for, you know, also these elements of trying to civilize them and do all these things, but especially in the economic sense, this was all meant to be very tilted towards benefiting the Europe. And as an example, basically no infrastructure was created in these nations. It was all about extracting resources and manufacturing, of course, back in Europe, right? So it's nothing but extraction without much going back in. Like that wealth is going directly to Europe, and it doesn't benefit really the locals that much, only to the extent that the colonizer invests into it, which again is going to be a bare minimum to make money. Well, when these European nations leave and this decolonization process ends, they didn't leave these nations with anything. They have no infrastructure. They don't have anything. They don't have jobs that can exist and continue to exist normally now that they've left, right? The factories, the processing, all that stuff was owned by the British and for example, the British, but other nations, but back in those homelands. So they were left with no structure, with nothing to start with. There's no capital, meaning money to invest in themselves. There is no capital at all. There also is no transition really for the government. It's like, all right, go have elections. And that ends up being a disaster in a lot of places where you have these ethnic groups. And by the way, the colonial borders that were set up here, like at the Berlin Conference, made no local cultural sense. They were total fabrications of trying to more agree about what's a border between this other, that another European nation can have, than what would make sense from a cultural standpoint, meaning these borders cut off groups from other parts of their group. It put together ethnic groups that have histories of not being able to necessarily work together. And now it's like, all right, we're leaving. This is your country. Good luck, right? And, oh yeah, you better like have elections and stuff like that. Then you get these elections and you find out there's all these diverse groups that probably have no often business being in a country together, that can't agree on any politicians. Yeah, you're going to have these elections, but it's pretty hard to have a successful democracy if the guy that, or, you know, the person that wins here wins with 10% of the vote. You know what I mean? And then you have 13 other people that were being elected that have less than that. It's hard to do that. So you have political nightmare happening. You have an economic nightmare because these countries don't have anything to start with. And this decolonization process, yeah, they're independent, but they're going to struggle. And you see that with the struggle of African nations today, although Africa is growing economically, and some places more stability, some places, many not. Many are in as bad a shape as they were. And Africa kind of got left behind in the dust there because there was no transition process or incentive for these nations that are leaving to leave. They're like, how can you ask for more? We're giving you independence. We're giving what you want. You can't ask for anything else. And it's been a struggle and basically a catch-up process ever since.
Without the empire, the world would have looked very different today. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
Awesome. Well, I really liked this little mini-series, this little two-part series. It was great. Of course, it's hard to sum up the British Empire in two 20-minute videos. Of course, they went over, glossed over a lot of things. And of course, they're going to miss some things. But don't be don't be one that gets kind of upset about that, because it's just not possible, to hit that. I saw plenty of comments on the first video about, oh, they missed this and this and this, and of course they are, right? Especially if your goal is to not necessarily be a giant comprehensive and try to have every detail, but try to sum something up into an entertaining 10-minute video. Makes a little bit more sense there. But if you do think there were things that maybe should have been covered, I mean, put them in there. Let's let our readers look at them and get educated. So anyway, fantastic. Let's go ahead, and we're gonna kind of end things here. If you like this video and the video series, the original video will be down below. Give them a like and subscribe. Love if you like and subscribe here, and continue with me as I go through the internet and try to find more and more awesome history videos so we can all learn together. Some ways you can support the channel too. Subbing is fantastic. Another thing you can join our Patreon. Right now, one of the benefits of becoming a patron is to participate in a weekly poll for a video that will be on the channel. So if you'd like maybe a little bit more influence on what happens in here, you can do that. I currently have it set to someone of any value, starting basically, I think it's starting at $1 right now. If you pledge $1, you'll get to participate, and that's fantastic. A fantastic way to support the channel as well. So I really appreciate that. Another thing you can do, if you haven't yet, is to join our Discord server, where we have a bunch of other history buffs and history fans, and just overall, pretty good people that just like chatting about history. So you can join that. There'll be a link down below to join the Discord, as well as if you want to join the Patreon and all of those things. Everything should be found down below. But I do thank you for joining me here today, and we'll see you soon. Bye.